I don't expect you to believe everything I'm about to tell you, but I thank you for your attention. From what I've heard, from what I've read, it's common to think that ghosts are attached to a place, a physical space, specifically the place where they lived when they were alive. Others say the place where they died. I think almost all of us have heard the story of someone who encounters the appearance of a spirit when they come to live in a new place for some reason. We always see ourselves as the invaders, and these entities as the legitimate inhabitants of a place beyond fear. I think there is a certain empathy with ghosts, as if deep down we want to think that they have no bad intentions. That is why my story, what I'm going to tell you, is strange and out of the ordinary. It's something that I wouldn't know how to explain. I'm going to tell you what my family has been through for just over 2 years, and I remember exactly the first time I told it. Note, although I think that for everyone in the family, the beginning was marked at a different time for me. It was that time on a Sunday night when we were preparing to see a movie. My dad is a great movie fan, and he still has hundreds of VHS from some video rental stores that it had until 2005 or so, when it stopped being profitable. My sister and I had chosen a movie called The People Behind the Walls. After a few minutes of watching the movie, somewhat a voice caught our attention, a small voice singing a song, The Blue Star from Pinocchio. It took us a moment to realize that that voice, which seemed to be a girl singing or humming, did not come from the television. My dad stopped the movie and told me. He looked completely confused. "What are you doing here?" he told us, and he began to slowly, carefully check room by room, the entire house. I'm not sure why, but there was something in his voice that terrified us. That made us realize, which wasn't a good thing. It's not part of our instinct to be scared by the sound of a girl humming a song, except maybe when you know there's no girl in your house. When I checked the last corner, whatever she was singing stopped. I have never been able to bear to listen to that song again, and I have never even thought about seeing Pinocchio again, or the people who produce those songs. On this occasion, my dad wanted us to continue. He put on the movie, and we all pretended to watch it as if nothing had happened. But in the deep down, we knew that something had changed forever. I remember that even the popcorn had a bitter taste. That night there is a certain hopelessness, a certain feeling that no one can help you when you know that there is something that is not alive living in your house. 2 or 3 days later, I was woken up in the middle of the night by a desperate scream from my mother. Seconds later, my father's voice trying to calm her down. My sister ran to my parents' room, and she was standing there at the door. My mom was crying sitting next to the bed, and Dad hugged her and pressed her against his chest. He told us to go to Grandma's room and sleep together. That's the room. It had been uninhabited since Grandma died years ago, but it kept all its things intact. It is also the only room on the second floor without windows, and precisely for that reason my father had sent us there. In the morning we found out what had caused my mother's screams. I had a nightmare. I dreamed again about that first night and that we heard the girls singing. But in the dream my mother was alone searching throughout the house. Something made her look for that girl desperately. Suddenly a heartbreaking scream scared her. A scream that stunned her as if it came from inside her in her own head. She opened her eyes, waking up to realize that it was she who was really screaming. And right in front of her in the window of that room on the second floor was the face of a girl without eyes, smiling from ear to ear as she seemed to float, just to observe her. And my dad woke up at that moment. The difficult thing for him was to calm her, encourage her and convince her that there was nothing in the window, when he could also see her. This being this thing that, I know is not a girl, came from suddenly our house and decided to live there to torment us. Although I can't say that before we didn't believe in ghosts, the truth is that we had never experienced anything like this, something supernatural. My parents began to live permanently stressed beyond the economic problems that worried them, especially my dad. Sometimes we could even be joking, until we noticed that the sun was starting to set. That night was falling. The girl was starting to be less shy with us. The first time I saw her, she was walking past the dining room towards the living room, carrying my computer to do a task and playing the television as background music. A bad habit I have. Out of the corner of my eye I saw a white spot on the table as if it were an animal on her. I stopped dead and was paralyzed, a laugh that almost gave me a heart attack. I was frozen, but with my eyesight I could see what seemed to be a girl in a white dress sitting as if she were a gargoyle on the table, as if getting between his knees, rubbing the palms of his hands as if it were a fly and smiling. I don't know how, but I can swear on my life that he was smiling. He got up, standing on the table little by little. That thing, with the girlish appearance, she got up and I'm sure she couldn't fit. She lowered her head when she reached the ceiling. It was just my sister and I. I don't know how. I don't know why. But my only reaction was to talk and yell at my sister. He heard it and ran closer, and that thing vanished into the air, or so we felt. I feel that it is very significant that in that panic attack he spoke to my mother. Although she was not there, I still see it when I sit in the room or I get to spend alone. Although my mother is no longer with us. They say that ghosts cannot harm you, but I am a witness of how these energies consume my mother little by little, night by night, until one day I can't stand it anymore. 3 months after it all started, this thing was seen more and more out of the corner of our eye, or just standing behind us and then disappearing. But it appeared in front of my mother. She described it as the body of a girl with face of an old woman, sometimes without eyes, with her skin increasingly rotten, but always with a macabre smile. It was a Tuesday like any other. I had spent the entire afternoon with my girlfriend, and at 7:30 in the afternoon, I received that call from my dad. My mom had decided to commit suicide by hanging herself in grandma's room, the only place where that thing didn't fit. My sister found it shortly after. The ambulance people told my father that she had died just a few minutes before the call. My sister in the emergency room. For months only he and I knew that detail. We didn't want to torment my sister with the idea that if she had arrived a few minutes earlier she might have been able to save my mother. But we only told her when she told us that that damn day it had taken longer to get in. Because when we opened the door someone pushed from inside and they laughed. That girlish laugh. The same laugh we heard all that night, as if they were making fun of us. I would so much like this to be fiction, that it was only in my head. When there is a family loss like that, when someone decides they can't take it anymore, the reaction of distant relatives outside the immediate circle is to think that the family had something to do with it, that the family could have done something to prevent it. It happened to us suddenly. Only that my mother's family never practically stopped worrying about us. Since the funeral my mother never told them what was happening, and let's be realistic. Only for a moment think about it and answer with all sincerity. You would do it. You would ask to help a person or a family if there is a spirit tormenting them at home and in solitude. That thing with the appearance of a girl seemed to get stronger. It began to now resemble my sister, who he became her favorite person to bother. Somehow that entity went through my sister's things. We returned from eating at my father's friend's house to find my sister's diary open, with letters and memories thrown all over the house, with one of her dolls in my dad's room. Things that were well stored in my sister's closet had been taken out and appeared dirty all over the house. My sister cried desperately while we helped her rearrange everything. My dad went to the downstairs for a broom and dustpan to lift some glass, and he came back pale. He came back with my sister's first communion dress in his arms. In the darkness of the living room, he said he saw the dress floating upright as if someone was carrying it since. When I turned on the light, the dress was already on the floor with a penetrating, horrible smell of putrefaction. I want to clarify that we are not changing house. It is something that we cannot afford. That is even out of the question, especially because it is my mother's house. The house where we grew up, and we are not going to leave it because this filth has decided to live here. It is not going to win us over. It is not going to take away more of what we have already lost. Pray, bless, clean the house. My sister and my mom had already noticed it. When they got too scared and started praying to this thing, they seemed to have fun. It seemed to take advantage of it to make fun of them, even though we never thought it would solve anything. And Dad spoke to a priest, a very close friend of mine, of the family. My mother accepted that the priest came, but reluctantly they came to bless the house. Obviously in Europe, I don't explain well what was happening, and I guess the father thought it was more about dealing with the loss of a loved one. And perhaps the priest omitted to explain that it was the place where he decided to take his life. He arrived accompanied by an elderly Doa Carmen who helped him with the work of the church. He walked around the house throwing blessings in Spanish, some in Latin, and left that same night very late. The next day in the afternoon there was a knock on the door. We were surprised to see that it was Doa Carmen. She asked us to come in, and we bought her a coffee. She asked us to be honest and tell her what was really happening in the house. And I think it was the first time we were really honest with someone outside the family. The first time we were honest about it. Doa Carmen inspired us so much confidence, and she really showed us to believe that we ended up in tears, telling her absolutely everything that had happened. The girl couldn't stop laughing at 3 in the morning. Mrs. Carmen left for her house, and even though my father offered to take her, she refused. They have to be strong and take care of each other now more than ever, he told us. The next morning, religious figures and a man who was already very old, but who gave us a calm that we really needed, showed up with holy water. He was a retired priest, and Doa Carmen had been aware of the situation. The man was very concerned that this thing that lives in my house could have physically stopped the door on that occasion while my mother was dying. I have seen too many things in my life, and many of them I still do not understand. He told us, I believe in God and I have seen his faith and among us, in many beings who came escaping from hell. He stayed all day. We went out for most of the afternoon and returned at night. He was still in the house very exhausted and told us that at this point he no longer had the strength to face such a being, despite his promise to return to the house every month to bless it, to try to free it from those forces, from those things, as many times as possible. Necessary. After 3 days we were in peace for 3 days until the others arrived. We tried to go out as much as possible. We even visited friends of my father whom we had not seen for years, some with whom I am sure he did not even get along as well, and on one of these visits my dad received a call. It was a neighbor. Something was happening at home. I received a text message from my uncle, my mother's brother, who has a small restaurant a few blocks from my house. He asked us to we went there immediately. When we got home we found what seemed to be all the neighbors on the street outside our house, which was with the doors open with all the lights on and shadows walking through the windows. A few hours before, horrible screams began to come out of my house. Desperate screams of pain and others of laughter and full of vulgarities. The neighbors came out of their houses to approach, but no one dared to enter. Someone called the police. One more neighbor ran out to the restaurant for my uncle to tell him that something was happening with us. Or at least that's what they thought when they arrived and heard the screams. He broke one of the windows without hesitation and entered. He got lost in the darkness while the neighbors watched from outside. The screams fell silent a little afterwards, but he did not come out. Minutes later, two municipal police patrols arrived, alerted by the neighbors. They forced the door to enter. They found my uncle unconscious and gave him first aid. When we arrived, the neighbors were milling around the small entrance to the garden, and my uncle was receiving care in an ambulance. The shadows that we saw through the windows were of at least 3 agents who were checking the entire house from top to bottom. When my uncle saw us, he approached us and hugged us like he hadn't in a long time. He hugged us tightly. He told us that he came to look for us and the house was much darker than it would be normal despite it being a full moon night. Inside you couldn't see anything at all. The lights didn't turn on. He ran to the second floor from where the screams came from, and they're right at the entrance to my grandmother's room, barely illuminated by the light from the window at the end of the hallway. A girl with an old woman's face, smiling from ear to ear. The girl was holding her hand to a very tall woman, a naked woman with her skin falling off her body. He didn't believe what he saw and tried to turn on the lamp on his cell phone. By the time he did, no one could be seen at the door. He tried to run down, but something hit him in his stomach. He had come across something, although he had it in front of him, he couldn't see it. The darkness was as if he had his eyes closed. He thought it had been a piece of furniture and extended his hands to touch it. He felt a hard, wet ball. Then he felt somehow many hairs on her and skin falling at the touch of his fingers. Something moved, something laughed, and he felt the girl's laughter in his hands as he held her head. The next thing he remembers, the next thing he saw was a police officer trying to revive him. I had never seen him like this, and not even at the funeral could we see so much sadness and feeling. My uncle cried while he told us what happened as a child. My dad asked him if those screams were terrifying. Why the hell had he dared to enter our house in the dark to look for us, instead of waiting for the police? He told us because one of the voices shouting was my mother's.
I haven't seen the videos where my brother tells our story. It's not because it's wrong that he did it. He asked me before contacting them. I just can't. Don't judge me. Don't feel bad either, and it's just something I don't want. No, I want to relive. Not in this way. I also apologize if I don't want to talk about my mother's death, about what happened that day. I don't know if I'm ever really ready to do it. Again, I hate being in this house as much as I hate being in this house. Hours that came to it to change our lives. The house where all our memories are. Where I remember my mother, my grandmother, where I grew up. The same house that the neighbors now avoid, where people cross the street so as not to walk in front of them. No one visits us anymore. No one likes to be in a house where you can hear footsteps, where there is a voice that laughs at you if for some reason you find yourself alone at some point, in the downstairs bathroom where visitors came in. You can constantly hear a woman breathing. Since what happened with my uncle when the police came, some neighbors stopped talking to us, and I understand them. I would have done the same thing every time I returned from school and passed by my uncle's restaurant. He asked me if there is anyone at home. If I say no, don't let me come alone. He prepares me something to eat until my father comes by, or until my cousin arrives and joins me. My cousin and a friend of mine. Brother, his girlfriend, Mrs. Carmen, and the priest are the only people who dare to enter my house. I still talk to the father about what happened in my room from the first time he came. On that occasion, he dedicated himself. As I understood, he went to work crying all over the house, but when he returned, he concentrated on my room and prayed for a long time. At one point, he even called Mrs. Carmen to come in too. And a few minutes after starting the ritual, something started bothering him. According to what Mrs. Carmen told me, while the priest was praying on his knees next to the window, he heard something fall on the ceiling, and he was accustomed to hearing even worse things in the house. But whatever had fallen began to crawl. You could hear it, as if they were crawling along the ceiling until they reached a corner of the room above my closet. The priest where he was heard the door open slowly without stopping his prayer vault, but he couldn't see anything, even though he felt a gaze on his chest. That stuck to him from the darkness of the closet. I don't know if my brother mentioned it, but here these entities can only be seen out of the corner of the eye, and the reflections of the windows, and sometimes in the mirrors. Only my uncle was physically shown to him, and my brother, they saw them materialize in front of the father. Knowing this, he took my vertical mirror and placed it in the corner of the room right in front of the closet door, and continued his prayer facing him so he could observe what was happening in the darkness. He began to draw a figure as if approaching, preparing to leave. The minutes passed, and he thought that it could be his imagination playing a bad trick on him. He then placed himself in front of the window, opening it outward a few centimeters, enough for it to reflect directly towards him. The closet door. As soon as he placed it, he saw a huge fat woman with messy gray hair come out walking towards him, so fast that he didn't even have time to see her face clearly. That's when he spoke to Mrs. Carmen, and she was the one who told us everything that the father saw. The priest did not tell me that it was preferable that I go to sleep in my grandmother's room. That fat woman was present. She was the third to arrive. She does not go down to the first floor. We can recognize her steps heavy and her breathing deep. When we close the doors at night and she walks down the hallway, sometimes it is so easy to forget everything and think that everything is as before. I remember a particularly nice day at school, and it is that after what my mother had had a hard time getting along, even shortly before one of my best friends moved out of the city, that day I told you about my friends, who had some surprises too. The classes, even the teacher let us leave a few minutes early. Everyone got together. They had agreed. Suddenly, I don't know where, everyone came out and we hugged each other. We cried. Then we controlled ourselves. We laughed. We all went to eat together. I realized how beautiful my group of friends is and how much I was missing not living with them. We planned to meet the girls to make a call that night, and one of my friends brought me home. Meanwhile, he told me how much he cared about them. He told me how much he missed me and how it hurt him that I wasn't with them as before, and it gave me great pleasure. It gave me great pleasure to feel so loved and supported. I entered the house, and even the light coming through the windows seemed to illuminate it in a different way, as it had not done in a long time. I entered my room and lay down due to the emotions of the day. Perhaps I fell asleep deeply in a matter of minutes, and I dreamed of my friends, of the boy who had just taken me home. I dreamed of the last vacation we took as a family years ago. And suddenly that laugh again. That stupid laugh that seemed to come into my dreams to tell me that nothing was right at home. It was still infested, that my mother is no longer here, that neither my brother nor I are the same as they taught us. And I wanted to open my eyes, and what I saw, I don't know if even in my dreams it was that horrible fat woman floating right above me, right over my bed, stretching her arms towards me and screaming with her face, because I couldn't hear her, but I could see her expression and her empty black eyes. I remember running. I remember leaving my room home, and I went to my uncle's restaurant to wait until my brother arrived. My cousin arrived first, and she accompanied me back home. My uncle's family has also become accustomed to experiencing what happens in this house from the outside. What happens to us. When I got to my room for my cell phone and I had text messages, My friends were about to pick me up for that sleepover that had excited me so much, hours before I was taking what I needed when Dad arrived. No matter what I experienced, and I didn't tell him what had happened to me. I saw him happy and smiling, and it is so strange that that happens now that I didn't want to ruin his day. And seeing how I ruin his day by telling him what happened to me. I was talking outside. My dad smiled at me and shrugged his shoulders while I hugged him. I ran out. We left my cousin at home and we went to buy something to eat. And for a few hours I lived a normal life. Living what every girl my age does. I guess I should live. Until they got there too. Until suddenly I saw that girl looking at me from outside the window. That girl with the face of an old woman smiling and wearing, I'm sure, she had her first communion dress on. I felt like I was going to die. Faint, but somehow my desire to not be the strange one, to no longer be the one who suffers, the one who always draws attention, made me control myself. And I pretended that nothing was happening. I don't know how, but I did it, and I did it all night when we went to sleep. That was when at least I realized that no matter where we go, they are going to follow us. Weeks later, one afternoon eating at my uncle's restaurant waiting for my dad or my brother to come by, I received a call from a boy from school talking to me in an unusually serious tone. A boy from another class who is not aware of everything that happened. He asked me, "Are you in your family's restaurant?" And he answered himself by saying yes. No shit. I heard him say often after a long silence. Then he continued with an extremely nervous tone. "Seriously, don't be scared," he told me. "Some friends and I were playing Ouija, just joking as always. Suddenly it seems that if we start talking to someone and that he mentioned and told us where you were right now and said that he likes living in your house."